In the mid-14th century, Europe was experiencing a period of significant growth. Urban centers were expanding, trade networks were flourishing, and for many the quality of life was improving. However, in October of 1347, a fleet of 12 ships arrived in a Sicilian harbor carrying a virulent disease that would rapidly overwhelm the continent. This was the Black Death, a pandemic that in just a few years would kill an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population, profoundly altering its social and economic structures and accelerating the trends that would mark the end of the Middle Ages. Prior to the arrival of what was then called the Great Mortality, the 14th century world was characterized by unprecedented interconnectedness. The vast Mongol Empire had established a period of relative stability known as the Pax Mongolica. This secured the legendary Silk Road, making it safer for travel and commerce than at many previous points in history. As a result, caravans carrying silk, spices, and other goods moved from Asia to the ports of Europe. This network of exchange, however, facilitated not just the movement of cargo and ideas, but also of a far more dangerous, unseen agent. In Europe, society was largely governed by a rigid feudal system, with a monarch at its apex, followed by nobles and clergy, and a large population of serfs at the base. The Catholic Church functioned as the ultimate spiritual and intellectual authority, providing the framework through which most people understood the world. The growing cities such as Florence, Paris, and London were becoming crowded centers of commerce. It was this very interconnectedness and prosperity which would prove to be the continent's primary vulnerability, as the trade routes that supplied Europe with its wealth would soon become the vectors for a pestilence that would bring it to its knees. The origins of the Black Death have been a subject of historical debate for centuries, but modern genetic analysis has traced its ancestral strain to a specific region. Evidence points to the Tian Shan Mountains of what is now Kyrgyzstan. It was here, likely in the 1330s, that the bacterium Yersinia pestis appears to have crossed from its natural reservoirs in wild rodent populations, such as marmots, into the human population. Archaeological evidence from the region supports this timeline. Tombstones discovered near Lake Issyk-Kul, dating to 1338 and 1339, bear inscriptions that explicitly name a pestilence as the cause of death for a local trading community. Genetic analysis of the remains has shown that this was the source strain from which all subsequent Black Death strains evolved. Once established among merchants and travelers, the bacterium began a slow but inevitable westward migration, moving along the very trade routes that defined the era's prosperity. The plague's arrival in Europe can be traced to a specific military event, the Siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. In 1345, the city came under siege by the Mongol army of Johnny Beg. The siege continued into 1346, at which point the Mongol forces were themselves devastated by the spreading pestilence. Forced to abandon their campaign, the Mongols made a final, desperate tactical decision. According to the contemporary Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongol commander ordered the corpses of his plague-infected soldiers to be launched by catapults over the city walls. This act is now regarded as one of history's earliest examples of biological warfare. While it is probable that the disease would have entered the fortified city anyway, via infected rats, this assault likely hastened its spread among the defenders. Seeking to escape the now doomed city, Genoese traders boarded their ships and set sail for home, unknowingly carrying the plague with them. In October of 1347, 12 of these Genoese ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. Onlookers were met with a disturbing scene. The ships were crewed by the dead and dying, with the few survivors reportedly delirious and covered in dark boils. The Sicilian authorities ordered the fleet back to sea, but the measure was futile. The plague was already on European soil. From Sicily, the disease spread with remarkable speed. By January of 1348, it had reached the vital port cities of Genoa and Venice. From there, it moved to Pisa and rapidly inland to Tuscany, devastating Florence. The plague did not only advance by sea, it followed the continent's complex network of river and land-based trade routes. It reached France and Spain later that year, and by the summer of 1348, it had crossed the English Channel. By 1349, it was documented in Germany and Scandinavia, and by 1351, it had impacted nearly all of Europe, leaving a demographic catastrophe in its wake. The people of the 14th century lacked a germ theory of disease and attributed the plague to various causes, from divine punishment in an unfavorable conjunction of planets to miasma, or corrupted air. The true agent, Yersinia pestis, was microscopic and unknown to them. The bacterium manifested in three primary forms. The most common was bubonic plague, named for its signature symptom, the buboes. These were painful, swollen lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck, which were often accompanied by high fever, chills, and vomiting. Following the appearance of symptoms, death occurred in a high percentage of cases, often within a week. The second variant was pneumonic plague, which resulted from the infection reaching the lungs. This form was especially dangerous as it could be transmitted directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. The third and most lethal form was septicemic plague, which occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. This led to high fevers and a condition known as disseminated intravascular coagulation, causing hemorrhages that blackened the skin and likely gave the Black Death its name. The septicemic form was almost universally fatal. The mortality rate of the Black Death was staggering. Modern historians estimate that it killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's total population, which amounted to an estimated 25 to 50 million people in a span of just a few years. The world would not witness a demographic collapse of this magnitude again until the 20th century. The impact was not uniform. Densely populated urban centers with poor sanitation were particularly hard hit. Florence, a major cultural and economic hub, may have lost over half its population. The writer Boccaccio, a survivor, described a complete societal breakdown, with so many dead that mass burial trenches had to be dug. Cities in Germany like Hamburg and Bremen may have experienced losses between 60% and 70%. England's population was roughly halved, and it is estimated that around 1,000 villages were abandoned entirely. However, certain isolated regions, such as parts of Poland and the Pyrenees, were comparatively spared. For the majority of the continent, the event was cataclysmic. The scale of the death toll caused the rapid disintegration of social structures. The Florentine chronicler Agnolo di Tura recorded that father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. People fled cities in panic, abandoning homes and sick family members. Funeral rites, a central aspect of medieval life, were often dispensed with as the sheer number of bodies overwhelmed the living. In the face of this inexplicable horror, some sought scapegoats. Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells. Despite the fact that Jewish people were dying at similar rates and that Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls declaring their innocence, a wave of violent pogroms ensued, particularly in France and Germany. The plague also precipitated a crisis of faith. The clergy, unable to stop the pestilence, died in great numbers as they administered to the sick, shaking popular confidence in the Church's ability to intercede with God. This led to divergent religious responses. Some embraced extreme piety, such as the flagellants, who marched between towns whipping themselves as a public act of penance. Others turned to a form of hedonism, adopting a nihilistic outlook in the face of what seemed to be inevitable death. For centuries, the accepted transmission model for the Black Death has centered on the black rat and its fleas. However, many historians and scientists now question if this model fully explains the 14th century pandemic. Several factors raise doubts. The speed at which the plague propagated across Europe seems too rapid for a purely rat-borne vector. The disease spread effectively during winter months when flea activity would be reduced, and archaeological excavations have revealed a scarcity of rat skeletons at many medieval sites. This has led to an alternative, or perhaps complementary theory, that the Black Death was primarily spread by human ectoparasites, specifically human fleas and body lice. Modeling studies have indicated that a transmission model based on these parasites aligns more closely with the observed mortality patterns. This would account for the rapid transmission within households under the crowded conditions of the era. It does not preclude rats from having played a role, particularly in carrying the disease between population centers. It seems likely that the plague's devastating efficiency was the result of a combination of multiple transmission vectors, including the rat flea model, the human parasite model, and the airborne spread of its pneumonic form. While the initial outbreak subsided around 1351, the plague would return in recurrent waves for centuries. The aftermath of the first wave, however, left behind a transformed world. The massive death toll created an acute labor shortage, which fundamentally rebalanced the power dynamic between landowners and peasants. Desperate for workers, lords were forced to offer higher wages, effectively ending the system of serfdom based on labor obligation. This newfound economic mobility for the lower classes was a direct challenge to the aristocratic order. Attempts by the ruling class to cap wages led to a series of major uprisings, including the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. The feudal system was in terminal decline, and the foundations of a wage-based economy were being established. In addition, the plague spurred the development of public health. In response, Italian city-states pioneered some of the first organized epidemic responses. In 1397, the port city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, established a 30-day isolation period for arriving travelers, a Trentino. This was later extended to 40 days, or a quarantino, which is the origin of the modern quarantine. Cities created boards of health, implemented sanitation laws, and managed burials, representing the first institutional steps toward modern public health. In the end, the Black Death was more than a demographic catastrophe. It was a historical catalyst. It acted as an indiscriminate force that leveled the rigid social pyramid of the Middle Ages. By eliminating such a large percentage of the population, it set in motion a chain of economic, social, and religious upheavals that the old order could not withstand. The decline of feudalism, the rise of a laboring class with new economic power, the deep questioning of institutional religious authority, and the dawn of public health can all be traced back to the plague years. It marked a violent and painful transition out of the medieval era, and in doing so, helped clear the ground for the social and intellectual developments of the Renaissance. The bacterium Yersinia pestis still exists today, a lasting reminder of the profound and enduring power of disease to alter the course of human history.